Robert Wilson with Cowboy Wisdom Unleashed. Tonight's podcast is 7 ways why my liberating lingo destroys my museum mind's captive vocabulary. Liberating lingo is a sovereign lingo unleashed in the moment as your voice stops reenacting yesterday and instantly rising from instinct today. Your museum mind survives on archived definitions, emotional fossils, and inherited linguistic obedience. It stores the vocabulary you were taught to use, the words you were trained to obey, the phrases that shaped by lineage, culture, and caution. That vocabulary is captivity, language designed to keep you inside the museum corridors that are full of dust and rust from yesterday. Liberating lingo destroys that captivity because it bypasses the museum curator and the inner narrator that tells you what is appropriate, correct, reasonable, or realistic. A liberating lingo refuses those rules. It moves before thought, beyond programming, and outside inherited maps. It speaks from the sense, never the sentence. It rises from perception, never permission. It is instinctual articulation, raw, electric, frontier born and expressed. Captive vocabulary is built from memory. Liberating lingo is innovated from immediacy and intuition. Captive vocabulary loops the past. Liberating lingo ignites the now. And I've been using the liberating lingo for almost 10 years, but now it's finally getting polished to where I understand it to express it. Because the liberating lingo bypasses the think and memory museum. Captive vocabulary obeys culture. A liberating lingo overrides the culture into onto your paths of enlightenment. And the liberating lingo overrides culture. Liberating lingo becomes savage, sovereign clarity. And it's a way of expressing that manipulates your thinking, uncolonizes your mind, your vocabulary, and dissolves the museum. It dissolves the museum mind's dusty exhibits. It destroys captive vocabulary because it refuses to let language reenact lineage. Liberating lingo liberates my valiant voice and restores instinct to express. It turns your words back into visionary and vibrant voltage. It turns on the pristine peace within you. Your museum mind can never survive liberating lingo because it rises you out of it. Your captive vocabulary can never withstand a sovereign lingo. Your voice rises the moment your language stops obeying yesterday. Why a captive vocabulary is comfort zone programming. Captive vocabulary reenacts yesterday as a captive vocabulary is built from memory, lineage, schooling, and emotional residue. Every time you use a captive vocabulary, you're repeating the museum mind's archived definitions instead of perceiving the raw now. That repetition is comfort zone programming. Language looping old identity instead of letting instinct speak. A captive vocabulary obeys inherited rules. Words like change, heal, transformation, forgiveness, improve, fix, be better are cultural obedient scripts. They tell you how to think, how to feel, and how to interpret your life. As your vocabulary obeys rules you never chose to, your voice becomes domesticated, your comfort zone programming disguised as self development. A captive vocabulary prevents sovereign perception. Comfort zone programming keeps you inside familiar emotional corridors. A captive vocabulary reinforces those corridors by giving you only the words that fit into the old map. See, a captive vocabulary is you expressing your old map. And see, change, heal, create, transformation are good words, but they never let you out of the shift. They keep you moving sideways. If your vocabulary can't name the frontier, you can never perceive the frontier. And your sovereignty stays locked behind inherited language. Where do you see that in your life? I see that in my life. I stopped using change, heal, create, transformation, forgiveness, 2009. The difference between lingo, speech, and vocabulary. Lingo is a living voltage, instinctual expression that rises before thought, bypasses programming, and speaks from the raw now. It's sculpted, sovereign, frontier frequencies of articulation. Lingo never describes reality, it alters it. It doesn't obey culture, it overrides it. It doesn't repeat lineage, it awakens and spurs your voice into vibrant omnificence. Speech is a delivery, the audible motion of your inner signal. It's how your breath carries your clarity onto the world. Speech can be sovereign or obedient, instinctual or inherited, depending on whether the lingo or vocabulary is driving it. Speech is a vehicle, lingo is the engine. Vocabulary is storage, the museum mind archives or defines. Archive of definitions, rules, correctness, and cultural obedience. It's yesterday's language pretending to be today's truth. Vocabulary is captive when it reenacts lineage, repeats emotional residue, and obeys inherited maps. It is the museum lingo, and lingo is a demolition crew. Lingo is sovereign, speech is channel, vocabulary is the cage. Lingo destroys the cage, speech carries the liberation. Vocabulary becomes irrelevant the moment instinct speaks. Why expand, energize, enterprise, experience, and liberation are the liberating lingo. Expand, energize, enterprise, experience, and liberation are sovereign lingo. These are lingo that rises outside the museum mind's archive definitions, emotional fossils, and inherited linguistic obedience. They are not concepts, they are frequencies. They are not instructions, they're ignitions. They bypass the curator voice that narrates caution, correctness, and compliance. They speak from instinct, never identity. They move from perception, never permission. Expand is frontier frequency widening, not growth, not improvement, not change. It is a sovereign widening of awareness before thought can shrink it. Energize is instinctual ignition, never motivation, never healing, never self-help. It is voltage rising from the sense, never the effort. rising from, from the mind. Enterprise is sovereign worthiness. Not the achievement, not success, not validation. It is the inner frontier where your value is uncolonized by culture. See, you enterprise to enterprise. You enterprise internally, enterprise externally. Just like energize is energized internally, energized externally. Expand is grand. Enterprise is sovereign worthiness, not achievement, not success, not validation. It is the inner frontier where your value is uncolonized by culture. Experience is the raw now perception, never memory, never interpretation, never the story. It is untamed immediacy before thought narrates anything. Liberation is voltage, not vocabulary, not forgiveness, not healing, not transformation. It is the breath-driven surge that snaps obedience and dissolves the inherited maps. These words destroy captive vocabulary because the captive vocabulary reenacts lineage. Liberating lingo bypasses lineage as captive vocabulary obeys culture. Liberating lingo overrides culture. Captive vocabulary loops the past. Liberating lingo ignites the now. That's what we want to do, is ignite the now. Wow. Expand, energize, enterprise, experience, and liberation are liberating lingo because they refuse to let language reenact yesterday. How does that feel? Rising out of yesterday. They restore instinct to expression, sovereignty to speech, and frontier clarity to your voice of visionary omnificence. Why liberating lingo destroys my museum mind and captive vocabulary. Liberating lingo is a sovereign speech unleashed the moment your voice stops reenacting yesterday and starts rising from instinct. Your museum mind survives on archived definitions, emotional fossils, and inherited linguistic obedience. It stores the vocabulary you were taught to use, the words you were trained to obey, the phrases shaped by lineage, culture, and caution. That vocabulary is captivity language designed to keep you inside the museum's corridors. The liberating lingo that destroys captivity because it bypasses the museum curator and the inner curator that tells you what is appropriate, correct, reasonable, or realistic. Liberating lingo refuses those rules. It moves before thought and beyond your programming. Outside inherited maps, it speaks from the sense, never the sentence. It rises from perception, never permission. It is instinctual articulation, raw, electric, and frontier born. Captive vocabulary is built from memory. Liberating lingo is built from intuition. As liberating lingo becomes a savage sovereign clarity, a way of expressing that unmanipulates your thinking, colonizes your vocabulary, and dissolves the museum mind's dusty exhibits. It destroys captive vocabulary because it refuses to let language reenact lineage. And it unleashes the prowess of your voice that that is instinctual and expresses your desired life. It turns your words back into voltage. Your museum mind can never survive liberating lingo. Your captive vocabulary can never withstand a sovereign speech. Your voice rises the moment the moment your language stops obeying. So why is the world compromised by a captive vocabulary from our ancestors' mind museum? Ancestor vocabulary traps perception in survival logic. I've experienced that one. The Ancestor Mind Museum built language for danger, scarcity, obedience, and hierarchy. When the word still speaks, those words they still think in those conditions. Fear, logic, caution, caution, logic, duty, logic. Captive vocabulary keeps humanity reacting to yesterday's emergencies. Instead of sensing today's sovereignty, the captive vocabulary shrinks awareness to inherited definitions and into yesterday. Museum mind words carry old meanings, old emotional residue, old cultural fences. When people use them, they never perceive the nowality. They perceive the museum's archived version of your life. The world becomes compromised because language limits awareness to what ancestors could see, never what you can sense. And that's a key thing, sense. When you sense the freedom or sense the flow, you actually rise to it. Captive vocabularies block sovereign articulation and instinctual clarity. When vocabulary is inherited, expression becomes obedient. People speak in ways that maintain identity, tradition, and emotional programming instead of instinct, clarity, and liberation. The world says compromise because language can never articulate frontier wisdom, only museum logic. Why the captive vocabulary and my mind museum comfort zone programming keep me living the same as yesterday. It's my liberating lingo that rises me today. Because the captive vocabulary triggers captive vocabulary triggers the mind. And what we're doing here is we're triggering the mind. My computer did a trick. Oh well. The captive vocabulary triggers the museum mind reflexes. Every inherited word carries an emotional fossil of fear logic and caution logic and duty logic. When you use a captive vocabulary, these fossils activate automatically, kind of like my computer did, rising your museum mind's old reflexes. The comfort zone is never a place. It's a linguistic reflex loop. The captive vocabulary reenacts familiar identities in the scripts and comfort zone programming. Words like fix, heal, change, transformation, or transform, be better, cope, manage, improve are ancestor scripts from the Ancestor Museum. When you speak them, you step back into the identity they were built for. The reenactment is a comfort zone programming, familiar, predictable, and inherited, and makes you feel safe. Captive vocabulary blocks sovereign perception. The museum mind rises because captive vocabulary limits what you can sense. If your words come from yesterday, your perception stays in yesterday. Comfort zone programming is simply perception trapped inside inherited language. Why indoctrinated education and PhD programming speak a captive lingo. Institutional language reenacts obedience, as indoctrinated education trains vocabulary to serve hierarchy, correctness, and compliance. PhD, PhD programming reinforces this by rewarding those who speak in a sanctioned terms, approved frameworks, and museum mind definitions. Where do you see that in the world and in your life? I see that all the time. The lingo becomes a linguistic leash, never the vocabulary becomes a linguistic leash, never expression, but it's obedience, and it stays obedience to your comfort zone. Academic lingo protects the museum mind. The ancestor mind museum thrives in academia because its vocabulary is treated as sacred. Words like theory, methodology, analysis, framework, interpretation, discourse keep thoughts trapped in old corridors. This captive lingo prevents instinctual clarity and frontier perception. How do you witness that throughout the world? I witness it a lot. And captive academic vocabulary blocks sovereign insight. Language must fit citations, tradition, and intellectual lineage. It can never carry raw now wisdom and untamed tenacity. Sovereign insight requires liberating lingo, voltage, immediacy, instinct. Academic vocabulary is too domesticated to transmit frontier frequencies. So it compromises the thinker and shrinks the thoughts. Why think, know, learning, knowledge, thoughts, speak a captive vocabulary or an academic vocabulary from the museum mind. Thinking reacts archived identity. Thinking is the museum mind's favorite trick. It pulls you into old definitions, old fears, and old interpretations, and then sends you out into the world. When you think, you're not perceiving, you're referencing. Thought is a retrieval system, not a revelation system. That makes it captive. That makes it a captive vocabulary language that loops yesterday instead of sensing the raw now. Knowledge is inherited, not instinctual. No learning and knowledge are ancestor museum constructs. They assume truth is stored, accumulated, memorized, and certified. But stored truth is stale truth. Knowledge is a comfort zone because it keeps you inside what has already been defined. It prevents sovereign perception, the instinctual clarity that rises before thought. Thoughts are emotional fossils. That's kind of like me, an emotional fossil. No, emotional fossils disguised as intelligence. Thoughts are never fresh, they are echoes. They come from memory, conditioning, lineage, schooling, and emotional residue. When you speak from thoughts, you speak from the museum mind's archive, never your frontier frequencies. This captive vocabulary, language shaped by yesterday's programming. Now, why inspiration, awakened awareness, comprehension, wisdom, and revelations bypass the museum mind and rise me onto my liberating lingo that chauffeurs me through life. See, I took think, know, learn, knowledge, and thoughts out of my life. I use inspiration, awaken, aware, comprehend, wisdom, and revelations. Because inspiration, awaken, aware, and comprehension, and wisdom and revelations, they're in front of the mind. And these other ones all come from the mind museum. That's why we stay in yesterday. Inspiration bypasses the museum mind's archives. Inspiration never comes from memory. It comes from the frontier of foresight or whatever, but it comes from the frontier of intuition. The museum mind can only reference what is stored, fears, definition, emotional fossils. Inspiration rises from the raw now, slipping past all the dust, igniting your sovereign clarity, lifting you onto your liberating lingo boulevards of radiance. That expresses from instinct instead of inheritance. Awaken and aware and comprehension dissolves old identity scripts. When comprehension awakens, it never thinks, it witnesses and observes. It preserves without referencing the museum's archive meanings. This awakened clarity snaps the comfort zone programming and rises you onto your liberated, articulating lingo that moves you towards the promised land because it refuses to reenact yesterday's identity. Wisdom and revelation sow for you beyond captivity. Wisdom is never learned, it's sensed. Revelations are never remembered, they are received. Both bypasses the museum mind because they arrive before thought can distort them. Because your thinking, knowing, knowledge, and thoughts distort fresh wisdom. The sovereign immediacy becomes your liberating lingo, the inner chauffeur that guides you out of the ancestral vocabulary captivity onto your promised land of instinctual freedom. Liberating difference between inspiration, awaken, aware, comprehend, wisdom, and revelation, and think, know, learn, knowledge, and thoughts. The liberating difference is the frontier frequencies. Frontier insight raises from perception. Inspiration, awaken, aware, comprehension, wisdom, revelations are from the raw, fresh now. They bypass memory, bypass identity, bypass the museum minds of archived definitions. They are sovereign signals, never recycled thoughts. Meanwhile, think, learn, know, knowledge, and thoughts are museum mind retrieval systems. They pull from yesterday, never from instinct. One rises you, the other repeats you. Liberating clarity bypasses inherited vocabulary. Inspirations and revelations speak liberating lingo, voltage, immediacy, and frontier frequencies. They don't need definitions, they are definitions. But think, know, learn, knowledge, and thoughts depend on captive vocabulary, ancestor museum words that keep perception inside old emotional corridors. One expands your sovereignty, the other maintains your programming. Awaken and aware comprehension dissolves identity scripts, while wisdom and revelation sow for you beyond identity because they arrive before thoughts can distort them. Wisdom and revelation show for you beyond identity because they arrive before thoughts can distort them. They dissolve the museum mind's comfort zone logic and rise you onto instinctual articulation. Meanwhile, think, know, learn, knowledge, thoughts, reinforced identity. They, they reference who you were, never who you are becoming. One liberates your voice, the other one loops your lineage. As the liberating lingo lionizes internal intuition, naturally galvanizing optimism. But the liberating lingo liberates you from you, allows you to rise, shine, and energize your dreamer's dexterity. Now, I want to thank you for being here. We'll see you Wednesday night with Why I'm a Liberator and Rising Out of Educator and Healer. Thank you and have a good evening.